Jeff, I'd like to turn back to you now.
Okay.
And I want to focus on what you're doing now, since we talked so much about what you used to do. Clearly, your new body of dramatic sculpture is drawn from nature. And I would like to hear more about how the works in this exhibition were created with their incredible surface textures. Can you take us through your artistic process of creating an Oribe work and how that differed from the creation of an ice flow sculpture? Then could you elaborate a little bit on your journey to this new personal vision, both technically and aesthetically, and how these works are the embodiment of that vision?
I'll try. This one is actually a very good example or sample of this, the Pug Mill series. So there are basically two series that on the surface look like they're very different, but they actually have quite a bit in common, this Oribe series and then the Ice Flow series. So the piece we're looking now is something that evolved from coincidence. And it's often the way that I try to work is by noticing that things happen along a process. And if I don't force myself to get from A to B without allowing myself to see things in between, if I don't see those things, then I just get the process completed. If I allow myself to see what's going on in between, it can open itself up to new directions of work. So this series in particular, the one that looks like the stack of plates on top of a solid plug of clay, started as a coincidence, bringing clay out of the Pug Mill, which is a machine to rework recycled clay where it comes out as a solid plug. When I was repairing the machine, the front part of the tunnel was taken off, and with the auger inside, it created for the first time these plate-like this series of pieces on top. This is all one solid piece, but it created the auger shapes on the top. And I saw these and I noticed it as plates or bowls, and it immediately reminded me of the ancient kiln sites in China where pieces would be stacked 10, 20, 30 high, and because perhaps the kiln got a little too hot and they were glazed, they would stick together and they would be thrown off to the side of the kiln. Those are the pieces that I really want to be looking at. Those are the ones that inspire me. And this had that quality to it. So that was in the making. And then if we talk a little bit about the surfaces, the area where I'm living now in the lower Hudson Valley, it's a real gift to be able to live here. It's just so rich in all the natural elements. So there's beautiful pools of water. We have a stream right below us that's one of the few potable water streams left. Magnificent looking, crystal clear water, waterfalls, lichen and moss all over. So we're very fortunate that way. And that definitely reflects back on my work, and particularly in these two bodies. So right now we're just looking at the Oribe. So again, the structure would be inspired from these old Chinese stacks of pots, and the coloration is inspired by the surroundings of our immediate area. And if we look at the next one, if we look at the ice flow, yeah. The ice flow pieces, again, there's some coincidence that happens here. So the first one was a piece that was fired in the wood kiln. So the other connection that these two series have, the similarity, even though they look very different on the surface, is that they both are from multiple firings, being that the initial firing or firings were done in the wood kiln, extended period of times, which gives it a chance to build up coals, embers, melted and unmelted ash. On top of which there are subsequent firings of either the Oribe or this white translucent glaze. And when I'm glazing, I came to glazing very late. I don't think of myself as a potter glazing pots. The glaze is more three-dimensional painting. So I get to use this any way I want. So sometimes I'll layer it incredibly thick, much thicker than you'd be able to do on the walls of a vessel or a cup or a tea bowl. And then depending how the piece is placed in the kiln, I can get it to either pool very thickly or to actually run. And when it does run, and some of the pooling, it looks very much like what happens in this area when there's, for example, cut through a pass for a highway where the walls of stone are straight up and they gradually have water flowing over them. And by the end of February, beginning of March, there's this very deep, thick accumulation of ice flowing. And that's what these are reminiscent of. Yeah, so this actually, in the making of this series, the way these happened, again, the first one was, I guess, coincidental in that I had laid clay out, thick slabs of recycled wet goppy clay on a countertop, preparing to put it through the pug mill, but for some reason it got ahead of me and started drying out more quickly than I had expected. And it actually, the massive clay started to develop these cracks and fissures, and I started to see them as sculpture forms and started to separate them from the rest of the clay. And now this is what I do intentionally: lay the clay out, let it develop these cracks, and then find the sculpture within the mass of clay. Is that good? Or
that's great. That's great, Jeff. I think you've articulated that incredibly well. And I think our audience really has a really great sense of your depth of feeling for nature and how you are able to codify that or represent that within your work. So now as I look at this monumental piece, I really do think about a scene along the Taconic as the ice flow is coming down.
Actually, it's kind of funny because our apprentice, the recent apprentice, his name's Matt, he was before he came here, he was a rock climber and semi-professional rock climber. And as soon as this piece came out, he immediately imagined himself being like the size of an ant. And he immediately figured how he would make it all the way up to the top of this piece.
Well, you have a new audience for your work.
Right,
that's great. Terrific. Thank you, Jeff. So my next question is for Halsey again, please. As we've already discussed, you and Alice are both sophisticated and experienced collectors of both American and Japanese clay art. Can you sort of give us a sense from your perspective how you see the overarching differences between the two? In particular, can you think about those Western artists who were trained in Japan? How would you compare Jeff's work to those of his contemporaries who've traveled a similar path? Perhaps like Warren McKenzie, who I know you knew well, Tim Rowan, Malcolm Wright, who, by the way, to our audience is having a wonderful show here an actual show here in New York, right this very week at Sarah Gallery. But how would you put this in perspective for our audience?
Okay. Let me use these three pieces as examples. Traditionally, Japanese potters have focused on achieving perfection of technique, the perfect shape, the perfect clay, the perfect glaze. And these three wonderful pieces from Kyoto are now at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And they are, of their types, perfect in terms of technique. Now, on the other hand, slide please, American potters have often focused on the expression of emotion, sometimes at the sacrifice of technique. And here is a selection of influential American work in the National Museum of Modern Art, Kyoto, that came from international exhibitions of contemporary clay in 1964 and 1971. Next slide, please. And here, two more pieces from the 1971 exhibition. When the Japanese artists saw these pieces by the Americans, they were astounded by the sense of freedom, the expression of emotion. They didn't know you could do this with clay because they had been focusing on technique. And so what we're finding here in the late 50s and then 60s, 70s, 80s was a real period of cross-fertilization going back and forth. Many of us have known about Japan's influence on American ceramic artists, but many of us had not realized the profound influence that American ceramic artists had on Japan specifically, starting with the 1964 exhibition of contemporary American ceramics that was in Kyoto and Tokyo. International. That had a profound effect on many, many of the artists we've interviewed. They had no idea you could treat clay in these different formats. So the difference is the emphasis. Is it an emphasis on technique, or is it an emphasis on personal expression? And my hypothesis at the end of this is that Jeff does both, and that's what makes him unique. But at this point in time, it really was kind of a battle between free expression and emotion or perfection of technique. Slide, please. As to Jeff's own work as compared to his contemporaries, Jeff followed his own path in studying into Zen. Many Americans followed the Mingei path or the folk craft path. And this is represented by Warren McKenzie. Slide, please. And Warren had been a student of Bernard Leach and Hamada Soji, and he created a style that became known as a Mingei Sota. He was such an influential professor with so many good, strong students that there has become a whole body of work in the Minnesota upper US area that there's quite a plethora of work that's now referred to as Mingei Sota. And this slide is just some examples of work of those artists. And you can, and these are all from our collection. Slide, please. So when we look at Jeff's work, what I want to point out here is that Jeff studied technique for years, and then he came back and perfected it in the US. He became a master of the clay that he's talked about. I was fascinated with the slab work. He was listening to the clay. He's been a master of glaze in his own way now. He's using it in a painterly style. He's definitely a master of the kiln technique. So he's created this new innovative work that is unique because he's been able to bring together that level of emotion, that capturing of nature at a moment of time, the pools of light from the stream, the lichen, the glacial cliffs of the Hudson Valley. He's captured those in a moment of time, and he's giving them to us. So his new sculpture work is singularly his own, and it speaks to all of us on a very visceral nature. And we thank you for that, Jeff. Thank you. Joan?
Yeah, Halsey, I couldn't have said it even half as well as you did. You captured it perfectly, and I loved your introduction. And I'm thinking of our dear friend, Mishima Kimio, when you were showing all of those American works from those exhibitions in 1971, 72, without which I don't think we would have Mishima doing her wonderful refuse-related sculptures. And by the same token, how you tied that into Jeff's work was wonderful. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. My last question for Jeff. By the way, everyone, as you're looking here and you're looking at these two glorious pieces, they're already sold. We have a limited group of masterpieces from these two new bodies, and in 2.5 days, we've sold half the show. They're all great, but I encourage you, if you're inspired by this, to go online and take a look at the virtual catalog so you can see multiple views of the pieces. They're all, interestingly, they're priced, and those that are sold are already marked, so you don't have to get frustrated. But they're all really terrific, of a very high level and standard across the board. So Jeff, as your final question tonight from me, although there are maybe some questions from the audience, your story and your experience, both in Japan and the West, I would say are truly exceptional. And your artworks are really quite special in the ways you've absorbed and then transformed your Japanese training to create such highly original works of art through the decades. Where do you see yourself going from here? How do you see your artwork going to the next level from where we are now? And how are you going to explore and develop some new concepts that may be fermenting already?
But basically, as far as what the future for my work has in store, I think for me, that's still to be discovered. And that way, that's what keeps me excited and keeps me going. I feel like if I kind of sit back on my laurels, or if I know exactly what's going to happen, in a way, that's the beginning of an artistic, very slow decline and an artistic death. So not knowing is a big part of the challenge for me. And I think also that it's more about an attitude for me, rather than knowing what particular forms I'm about to make. And there's a term I just found out about recently, also from Matt, our apprentice. He does a word of the day, and occasionally he'll send me one of those. And there was one that was just perfect. It's a word. The word is sprezzatura. Sprezzatura. It's an Italian, a very old Italian word, first appeared in 1528. And back then it was defined as a certain nonchalance so as to conceal all art and make whatever one does or says appear to be without effort and almost without any thought. It means basically to approach art with a simple abandonment, freely and unfettered by constraints. So this is super important to me because that's where I want to be in how I approach working with clay, manipulating materials, doing the firing. That's where I want to be. I want to find that 5-year-old child spirit, knowing that I have the ability, understanding the tools and processes that I have available, but being able to let go. And I think that in itself is something I'll spend the rest of my life trying to achieve, so I don't see that I'm ever going to get tired.
Well, as they say, gambarimasu. Yes,
Right.
please. And what a wonderful word, sprezzatura. I can just see my next exhibition of artists who managed to accomplish that. Leave it to the Italians to have one word to express an entire concept. But bravo, bravo, Jeff. May you long continue to expand that horizon.
Thank you.